Welcome back. Yes, those gentlemen join us this morning to sink their teeth on what you just heard from the president and the CBN governor about the redesigned Naira notes. Professor Ken Ife is a macroeconomic policy analyst. And then you got Wale Loa, the CEO of Growth Masters Consulting. Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Thank you.
Well. Prof, you know, the debate where the CBN governor says, well, if you want to withdraw large sums of money, you will fill uncountable forms. Okay, you can't even place a number right now. So several things going through different people's minds in terms of, wait a minute. Well, first of all, what do you think of that first?
I think it's a great move, actually. You know, if the truth be told, the redesign was long overdue, 20 years, normally 5 to 8 years. The average is 6 years. And two, we don't know the size of that economy. We know, what we know is that 2.6 trillion is out there, and then out of the 3.3 trillion. So less than 20% actually with the central bank, with the banking sector. But we don't know the size of the counterfeit economy. We don't know the exact size. I also know that being in ECOWAS, that the second currency across the whole of West Africa region is Nigerian Naira. And each time we go on missions, which is regularly, and we don't come to get BTA or PTA because we're not eligible. So what do you expect? You either carry your Naira in your pocket and go there and enter a hotel, go to Balogun Market in Ghana, you know, we shop. We shop with our Naira. It's accepted everywhere. And then if you look at the frontiers of Nigeria, in the northern frontiers, with all the Francophone countries in the northern frontiers, about 100 million of them are actively trading with Nigeria in the northern frontier. They don't use dollar, they don't use franc CFA, they're using Nigerian Naira. So you don't actually know how much of our Naira is out there outside our orbit.
I wonder
so you combine the two.
Yeah.
And then, so when you are tackling inflation, you really don't know how much money is there fueling inflation.
But what would the United States say themselves? Because
well, US
how
will
much
say the same.
dollars in
they don't
this
have any
country.
dollars.
So
but the thing is this, US is changing regularly because of the technology. Now, when the technology has caught up, and then the counterfeiting agencies have better technology than ourselves, then it begs the question. And then you could hear from both the president and the bank and CBN governor that the new currency, you know, has tracking facilities. It has the technology they say is unassailable. I don't know whether it's rooted in a blockchain technology, but I don't know. But it now means that not only that you are going to fill a lot of forms when you are carrying big money, but that money can be tracked. Well, so they know what money they give to each bank and which branch and all of that.
We'll come to that as we progress. But Mr. Olade, what are your immediate thoughts about what CBN Governor President said?
Thank you, Chamberlain. A number of reactions, some very amusing. It's interesting to hear the CBN Governor say too much money in circulation, they need to mop it up to curb inflation. But then, for me, I mean, the CBN governor should look in the mirror, you know, because if you printed 20 trillion Naira via ways and means, you know, for the FG to finance, you know, appropriations and all of that in the last how many years, in a clear breach of Fiscal Responsibility Act, you know, so who contributed to 80%, 90% excess liquidity that ought to be in the banking system that is out there on the streets, you know, so that's one. And then secondly, of course, I agree with him on the fact that if you're going to withdraw cash, you know, you've got to deal with a number of paperwork, you know, because, I mean, if you're familiar with any kind of banking or financial transaction outside of this country, you know it's only peculiar to Nigeria, where you carry huge words of cash. You want to buy a house, you have to pay cash, 40, 50 million, 100 million. You want to buy a car, it's the same thing. If you bring out £1,000 sterling in the UK, I mean, I'm sure all of you have experienced it, eyebrows will be raised. You know, in fact, if you're not careful, the cops will be...
Yeah, but pardon me to jump in, but we also know that in those climes, there is a system in place. Now, that's why perhaps we'll come to the multidimensional component of this whole thing.
Yeah.
So all of those other agencies and policies, they complement each other to the extent that they are safety nets. There is no need, in fact, there will be no need for you to have access to that amount of money.
Because
but
of
here,
mortgages and
same.
incremental payments and all of that.
Yeah.
I agree with you, you know. So, like I said, you know, for me, if we're going to curb inflation, I think this policy is not going to go anywhere with curbing inflation. We're trying to shy away from the heavy lifting of how to curb inflation, how to tackle multidimensional poverty. If this is intended to get criminals who have money, you know, in the bushes of Nigeria, bandits, terrorists, kidnappers, and all of that, fine, because they've got to bring this cash out. But then, even at that, you know, EFCC are meant to be there watching with eagle eyes to make sure that, okay, if you bring in X amount of money, we need to ask you questions. Where did you get this money from and all of that? But then the same people in the system are assisting them to beat the system.
But for the kidnappers,
yes,
they are not the ones who will draw the cash. It is the victims who will draw the cash. And
but they were paid. They were given to them,
yeah,
and they stashed them wherever they stashed them.
So if they are bringing them back.
They're bringing them out now. Not even kidnappers, even politicians, highly exposed persons, you know, who have stashed money in soakaways in you know, wherever. You know, they need to bring all these monies out. But information at my disposal is that, I mean, people in the financial system are assisting, you know, these individuals, you know, to beat the system, to game the system, as it were. So, like I said, but for me, really, the key point is, if we're going to deal with inflation, this is not the way. Because, I mean, if you remember, the FCC chairman last week or thereabouts had said, oh, the FX rate is coming down. In fact, in a month, it will come down to maybe 200 Naira to $1. For me, that's voodoo economics, you know. I mean, he's the professor, you know. You don't deal with high FX rates in that manner. Because as of this morning, FX rate to Naira to $1 is 7.90, you know, because water will always find its value. The only reason why our currency is weak against the dollar is simple. We're not producing. We're not exporting. We're not earning FX in sufficient quantity. Our crude oil exports, you know, when we export, we're meant to get money. But what do? We use it to import PMS, you know. And then, of course, now people are going to the source of the crude oil, breaking the pipelines, siphoning these funds away. You know, so, like I said, a lot of thoughts run through my mind. But principally, CBN should look in the mirror. You don't do 20 trillion by way of, by ways and means, you know, breaking the law in the process, you know, and all of that. So those are my initial thoughts.
Well, I know that Professor Kenny Faye will always try to be pragmatic about the situation. But I would like to just ask you gentlemen first, you know, about how the redesign hit you. I mean, whether or not we have to have a redesign, I think that both of you have made very fine points and also accepted the point of the CBN that this was long overdue and totally necessary. And I think a lot of Nigerians had accepted that as well, especially when you hear the other reasons that have been adduced to it. You know, if it is going to make sure that politicians do not steal funds, yes. If it's going to make sure that kidnappers, you know, do not hide money, if it disempowers kidnappers and criminals, by all means, why not? But finally, you know, the CBN governor said he was not going to wait for the initial date that he announced, and he wants the president to launch it right away so we can get this started. When you saw the new Naira notes, how did it hit you?
Well, it's, well, on paper, looking at them visually, there's more color on the new ones, so color means something. But what I can't see, what could be there is the electronic, what is there electronically. You can't see with your eyes.
The features, right? The security
no, the electronic features, security features. You cannot see with your eyes. It's the technology that will detect them and find out and tell us whether there are more. And I think they are very robust to give the governor the confidence to say you cannot counterfeit this currency. The other thing that he hasn't actually said is that if you, wherever you're wrong with this currency, we will track you, you know, which is a very important feature for that. But let me also say one thing, though. When 80% of your currency is out there, not in circulation, you're actually preventing the banks from lending this money to businesses that genuinely need to use that to create jobs. You've just kept them out of so
there was a report yesterday that said that the government is still getting, I think, about 60% of loans from banks. I mean, they still seem to be crowding out the private sector in terms of, where banks are preferring to loan their monies. But I'm still looking at, I mean, I know that men oftentimes have time for the soft things, but let me ask you, Mr. Oluwade, how did the redesign hit you? Because a number of people have said this is not a redesign, this is a recoloring.
No, I beg to differ. Maybe because, there were speculations that maybe the features, the main features, like, for instance, the personalities on the notes would have changed. Some are even speculated that maybe you would see President Muhammadu Buhari and all of that. And thankfully, because I would have, I mean, that was scary for me. But thankfully, that it didn't go that way, So a redesign is a redesign. The colors changed, but more to what, to the point that Prof made. I think there are certain security features embedded in these new notes, that makes tracking, So when victims of kidnapping, for instance, pay money to kidnappers, it's easy to track beyond mobile telecommunication tracking. You can also track this. I'm thinking that's part of it, So, I think and like I said, like we said earlier on, this was long overdue. This is something that should have been done 5-year, cycle. So this is long overdue.
Let's talk about what was released by the MBS just, I think, last week. The multi-dimensional poverty indexes is what we have, talking about the, many angles of poverty that Nigerians go through. From this report, we're told that 133 million Nigerians are now proven to be poor from the data that they have been able to gather.
Correct.
That is something that certainly should bother you.
Yeah.
We understand that this figure is even worse than what the World Bank had projected. I think they said they're expecting that perhaps as a result of COVID, 92 million people were going to be falling into poverty. But the MBS has since shown that it's far worse than what we projected. This is despite the best efforts of government and, trying to ensure that more people do not fall into poverty. All the interventions that they have put in place to try and ensure that those who are really vulnerable do not get as hurt by the adverse effect that COVID would have had on the economy. What are your thoughts on how we got here?
It's very interesting that you are looking at 92 million and 132 million. It is about what poverty did, we say multidimensional. It's about which of the poverty indicators have you responded to. But let me explain something. If you look at conservatively, if you look at the indicators, the social indicators, is education, is health, is employment, unemployment, underemployment.
Security.
And then you have security has come in with what works. Okay. Now, if you look at SDGs, the globally accepted sustainable development goals, we've all agreed on those globally. There are 7 of them that connect to poverty. So you have the no poverty, then zero hunger, and then you come down, clean water, access to this health care. So 7 of them that actually connect to social indicators. But what we were having before, we are UNDP Human Development Index that focused on child mortality, infant mortality, maternal health, longevity, and then you have World Bank Human Development Index that we are capital that was looking at if you born a child today, what happens in 18 years' time. So, but what multidimensional indicator has come was to bring all of them together. Now, you have the possibility that you could be touched by any of those. And they know there are 4 frames, 4 major dimensions: the dimension of health, the dimension of education, the dimension of work, the dimension of unemployment. Any of them can touch you. So when anyone touches you, you are in the net. But the intensity is what says how many of them hit you. Know the difference. If you are hit by any of these indicators, you are in the net.
Indeed.
But when there's a multiplicity of it hitting you, you comes to intensity. So that's that. Now, the interesting thing is that when they say 133 million, you have far more information today. You have the spatial dimension. which tells you, oh, the north, 63% of these are actually in the north of Nigeria. The other are in the south. And then it goes beyond that to say, oh, there are 6 states that are most affected, the most poorest of the poor, and 3 of them are in the northwest, 2 of them are in the northeast, there's 1 in the south, Bayelsa. It begins again, it moves forward to say, oh, the character of the people involved, there are more people in the young bracket. And even gives you more information that 29% of 29% of out-of-school children. And if you look closely at the out-of-school children, 93% of them are actually poor. So you now begin to see a link between being out of school and being hit by multiple poverty. The information is enormous. So you now have a lot for policy. So there is already policy arsenal from the global development, from the sustainable development goals. And now you now have more that links them for you to now say, oh, government, if you want to do something about the education of young people, go and look at UBEC. Why is it that UBEC has money, the states can only download it if they have only 50%, so they're holding back money because states are not developing. So there are so many ammunition that you can use now.
Well, before we go to Lagos, Mr. Oluwade, you have identified some areas where we seem to be missing it and how we can come out of it. Tell us about that.
Thank you, Chamberlain. What the MBS report starkly demonstrates is a failure of governance across all tiers of government architecture. How do I mean? Take food security. 100 under 5 die in Nigeria every hour. In a day, that's 2,400. In a month, that's 72,000. In a year, that's 864,000. And the 2 killer factors, number 1, malnutrition. Under 5s are dying of malnutrition every hour, 100. Every month, 72,000. Every year, 64,000. Number 2 killer, malaria disease, malaria parasite. So why should a Nigerian child be dying of hunger with the vast, acres of arable land at our disposal? Secondly, look at education. Now, when we talk about education, it's not properly been dimensioned here. So we think education is just people going to primary, secondary. The other day, there was a seminar or whatever where people, President Basu just drew the attention of the people that you guys are focusing on tertiary. And I use the Yoruba proverb that the secondary and primary education system has collapsed. So it's like a cripple carrying a load. And you are saying, oh, Mr. Cripple, your load is slanted, but the legs are gone. So our primary, tertiary, our primary, secondary education system has collapsed completely. What is the primary responsibility of government? The welfare and security of the people. What is welfare? Food, education, healthcare. So if you don't have primary healthcare centers across 774 local governments, across 8,812 wards across Nigeria, where mothers can take their infants, under 5s to, in a jiffy. You're going to have a crisis on your hands, And then, of course, you don't have MSMEs. I will tell you, Chamberlain, maybe later on in the course of this session, how China lifted 850 million persons out of poverty in 40 years. 2 things.
That's about 75% of what?
Exactly. World poverty figures. Two critical issues. The education is not secondary, formal education, it's vocational education system.
All right, my colleagues in Lagos will have a lot more questions for both of you. Go ahead, guys.
Thank you, Chamberlain. Let me begin with the question that Markwe asked, but especially around the poverty figures. But I'd like to be a little more specific around monetary policy. This, of course, let me begin with Mr. Oluwade. The MPI, that report says, in general, the incidence of monetary poverty is lower than the incidence of multidimensional poverty across most states. In Nigeria, 40% of people are poor, according to the 2018-2019 National Monetary Poverty Line. That's report, that comment is straight from the MPI 2022. Is that, and so if we juxtapose that with the newly redesigned Naira notes, is there any correlation in your own perspective, especially when we're talking about monetary poverty in the country?
I didn't get that question properly, Ayo. Can you repeat the question?
Well, the current report, the multidimensional poverty report, says the incidence of monetary poverty is lower than the incidence of multidimensional poverty across most states in Nigeria, attributing 40% of people poor according to the 2018-2019 monetary poverty line. In your opinion, is there any correlation between monetary poverty and the newly redesigned Naira in the light of cashless economy and all of that?
Brilliant question, Ayo. Brilliant question. Now, the federal government's interventionist policies, Malkwe touched on it earlier on, hasn't really, succeeded. I mean, evidently, and the basic reason is because government got its understanding of poverty, wrong. FG thought poverty means money out of pocket. So what do? So they were throwing money at the problem. Now, take education, for instance. There are 20 million children out of school in Nigeria. So if you have 20 million children on the streets of Nigeria who are out of school and they don't have skills, so the money in the system is not going to where it is needed to build vocational educational systems, to build primary schools, secondary schools, to hire more teachers, to provide facility for the children, give them, food and all of that. So, build primary health care centers that I touched on earlier on in all the wards, 8,812 wards in Nigeria, get doctors there, get nurses there, providing services. So the money in the system, has little or no impact on the vulnerable of our society. The money is actually being hoarded by a few individuals. I mean, look at what happened. There was a report I saw in one of the newspapers. I mean, between January and May or thereabouts, there was a very high, spike in the amount or quantum of cash in our system. Now, what happened within that period? Politics, electioneering. So there's so much money in the hands of a few Nigerians.
So, Mr. Oluwade, in that regard,
the vulnerable of our society.
My apologies for butting it. In that regard, it sounds like there isn't a long-term plan to ensure that that does not happen. With this MPI, the report that's just been released and is making all of the rounds and impact that it is making at the moment, the question around that now would be, how do we ensure that we reverse the figures and sustain that reversal long-term?
Brilliant question again, Ayo. Part of the solutions I have come up with in my own research and trying to profile solutions. Number one, there is a lack of, vision, a grand vision, a national vision. I listened to someone use the term, a national consensus. As Nigerians, especially the elites, we haven't decided that we can't, build our country and we can't manage this country, we can't govern this country as we're currently doing. We cannot have 133 million or 65% of our entire population living in miserable, conditions. So if I were to, if I was contesting for presidency, for instance, I would say, okay, what's the grand vision for all Nigerians? Number one, we need to have food security. No Nigerian child, will go to bed hungry. Number two, every Nigerian child of school-going age will be in school. It will be written, it will be, of course, this will all be backed by law. Number three, there must be a primary health care center in every ward, of Nigeria, every ward, not local governments. And we must replicate this twice every year. Because like I said, I alluded to China earlier. China did the great work they did, lifting 850 million people out of poverty in 40 years, growing from, very abysmal economic conditions to become, this economic juggernaut that is it. In fact, as we are currently, China is like a modern nation to Nigeria. where Africa is the highest trading partner of China, you know, and
essentially,
Nigeria is number one, you know,
my apologies
from China.
Yeah, my apologies.
Yes.
Sincerely apologize. I mean, essentially, you're saying we need to have a vision. Without a vision, we can't sustain our plans. That's what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let me ask Prof. Prof, you mentioned, you spaded around child poverty the other time, perhaps referencing the UNICEF report and even this MPI 2022 of the federal government as well. And of course, you also heard Mr. Luwade speak around the same thing. A UNICEF report 2022 also says that the federal government of Nigeria, talking about child monetary poverty, said the federal government of Nigeria will require approximately 1.02 trillion naira annually to lift poor Nigerian children out of monetary poverty. How do you see that happening? That's from UNICEF.
Okay, you know, we are somewhere in the ladder actually, because when you look at the child poverty and connect it to out of school, and this link has already been mentioned, and I talked about that already, you can see the effect of school meals. You need money to buy the school meal, and if it's being provided, nobody doubts whether it is effective. It is extremely effective, especially in the area of the north where we have the biggest challenge, that those are incentivized to go and have that education because they can have decent nourishment. So that is one dimension of it. But there's another dimension which flows from the question that you asked, my colleague, which is, don't forget that the money side of it is actually at the level of the individual, not at the level of the government and how government is carrying money up and down. No, it's at the level of the individual. So when you're at the level of individual, what comes to mind is cashless society. What comes to mind, how do you reduce the 40% unbanked? What comes to mind is how much infrastructure, payment infrastructure is going to enable anybody anywhere, especially something like USSD infrastructure, where you can use your Nokia to transact. You don't have to have other bigger mobile phones. So you begin to come to those areas, and then you can now see that there are certain things government is doing with central bank moving in that direction. They've got the Naira, so that you don't need to carry a lot of Naira and you can move. They have nearly 2 million people carrying POS and all of that in front of your house, and then you can transact. Then you have agency banking that is everywhere in the rural area and all of that, making it necessary for us to actually speed up this whole new Naira design, because we are chasing a wild goose. Where are these people? Where are the money in the village? You know, so there are things that are actually connecting to the individual in terms of progress on the monetary indicator, because the monetary indicator is looking at the individual. So we have one hand, how does it help the better enrollment and enrollment, the staying power of progression in education, then achieving something in education. Those four are indicators that the better access to resources would help you achieve at the level of the individual.
So it looks like the Naira redesign has taken the shine of the recent, well, I say hike in interest rates, essentially to sort of tame inflation. Because we can talk about what the Naira looks like, how, you know, that would impact on different things. But, you know, the value of the money itself is a big deal to Nigerians, not just Forex, but what it can purchase when you go to the market. So recently the central bank raised the interest rates from 15.5 to 16.5%. And I just wonder, seeing the inflation we have seen, food prices still going up, do you think that this even new redesigned Naira notes will be more valuable with this recent, we'll talk about the monetary and fiscal authorities, whether they are, you know, collaborating as the vice president and the president have said, but regarding this recent decision by the central bank, do you see this far-reaching enough such that Nigerians can have better value for their money?
Well, what I would say is I think there are some settled issues here. Settled issues that we need to make the change, and the change will help address some bit of insecurity and, you know, there are very settled issues. The one that is not quite settled is the impact it could have on inflation. But let's look at that. Inflation in Nigeria, there are three different types of inflation we have. One is the cost push inflation, and that is because of the structural factors aggravated by insecurity. You have power, you have water, you have road. All of them are 35% is the stock of infrastructure in Nigeria compared to 80% in South Africa. We all know how that is pushing the price. We also know that diesel is very critical for the power generation for the business community. And that has gone up by 300% increase. And there's still a direct, pass-through to inflation. We also look at the second part, which is the imported inflation. Now, imported inflation is so difficult for us because we are an import-dependent economy. When you are an import-dependent economy, you are simply on the transmission belt of anything global, anything that affects global supply chain, whether it's Russia or whatever crude, it doesn't matter. Even the oil and gas we produce, it doesn't matter. Once it affects the global supply chain, whatever you're importing from UK or wherever is already subjected to increase in the price. Like Europe, that depends on 40% of their gas from Russia, they're having a knock. And then whatever we buy from them is inflation we're importing. And that inflation import passes through straight to the consumer. And that's what connects to the pricing of Forex. Now, please, the case of Forex is that my colleague has already said it, is about pricing. We get 79% of our Forex from crude, 10% from gas, and the other 10% is whatever CBN is able to find from either those who are supplying the, diaspora remittance that dropped down from 26 billion to just over 5, or is it foreign direct investment or portfolio investment, and the jury is out on all of those. NNPC did a crude swap. It's supposed to be sending in $3 billion every month of crude proceeds to central bank. It's only sent 300, 10%. And then did a crude swap, direct crude swap to the people who are refining. And then they bring back the PMS and he says to government, well, I'm the sole importer and exporter. The balance here is 500 billion naira you are owing me, and they call it under recovery, and that is actually subsidy.
Prof, you're trying to say... Government goes and
borrows every month, 500 billion. So you can see that it's unfair. Listen to me, please. It's unfair for you to see a central bank that has to disburse $1.8 billion every month for import and is only getting 300 million.
So
it's unfair.
So the
we
question,
have to be very, very realistic
Prof,
about this.
So the question essentially is the redesigning and the recent hike in interest rate. Do you see that having far-reaching effect on inflation? And that was essentially the question. But it looks like you're saying we've not been able to establish that. Am I right?
No, there is a link, a further link, because when we do not know the size of the illicit economy, the illicit currency economy, then obviously whatever is out there is affecting inflation. Because after all, what the basic is inflation?
Okay.
Excess money chasing fewer goods and services. If half of that money is illicit, obviously it's impacting on inflation.
Okay.
By the time you sanitize that environment and make sure that all that comes into the banking system is the legitimate revenue money, the other ones will find their way.
Okay,
obviously,
let me ask
before they
Mr.
find their way,
Oluwade.
they will fight. They are fighting by buying dollars.
Right, because of time.
They are fighting back. That money is fighting back.
Let me bounce this off, Mr. Oluwade, pardon me, Prof. And I mean, regarding this illicit funds, I know the CBN governor said that about 2.73 trillion naira out of the 3.23 trillion naira currency in circulation was outside the vaults of commercial banks. So essentially, this was also meant to mop up 2.7 trillion. But over 3 weeks after that announcement, we saw that 165 billion naira had since been gotten back. And at this rate, if we were going to say, okay, we have 3 months to this, we'll even be doing less than 1 trillion naira. So I don't know for you how you're receiving that. Does that still speak to how huge the illicit funds are out there, or maybe we might need to step this up, give more time so we can be able to capture that 2.7 trillion, or at least maybe 90% or 80% as we saw in India when they rolled out theirs years ago?
You know, they always say that Nigeria...
No, pardon me, that's for Mr. Oluwade, Prof.
It's getting late. People are waiting for the last minute before they will go and do
Prof,
the final job.
I'm sorry, that's for Mr. Oluwade, just so we can get his view on this as well. Mr. Oluwade, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Kaode. I think there are moves out there to see that there's an extension on the deadline, so because I think the CBN did well anyway to give the matching orders, because Nigerians, if the CBN had said until March or June, Nigerians will wait, until the dying moment and begin a rush, So by saying January 21st is the deadline, so everyone has got to, comply. But it's not gaining traction because if there are 2.7 trillion, but what you have coming already is 165 billion, then of course we have a huge gap, to fill. So, but I think the best move would be to have an extension eventually.
So, gentlemen, just quick one before we go. Do you think we have the capacity to support the full cashless policy in the country that the CBN is talking about?
I think we do. Don't forget that the CBN has licensed MTN, Airtel, one others, and they already seen VAT they're allowed to deal with the VAT. They're investing on infrastructure, payment infrastructure. And that is why in 2020, our banks were posting 15% growth rates. When every other bank abroad, we are having issues. It's because of the investment that has gone out into pay. So people were locked down, but their phones were busy transferring money. And they just walk outside and they get money from POS and all that stuff.
That happens in rural areas too.
Yeah, no, but we have invested. They have invested on payment.
So we can, as we speak, right now.
Of course we can.
Do you think so?
Yes, I think so. But Chimberly, what's important to me is on the multidimensional poverty. Just quickly, we need to have legislation. If we're going to deal with this, legislation that controls population. GDP is growing at just barely 3%, and then population is growing about the same rate. By 2050, Nigeria is going to be 450 million people. At this rate, we're going to have a crisis.
To do what with the legislation?
Control birth rate.
To make it hard, limited to how many?
I don't know. We have to have a conversation around that. Secondly, we need to build vocational educational schools. We need skilled manpower. We don't have skilled manpower.
That's true.
That's why China, has leverage over the entire world. China has almost 12,000 vocational educational schools, 1,400 technical colleges, technical schools, technical training colleges, 1,400. So those are the models we need to copy if we're going to lift people out of poverty on a sustainable basis.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Professor Ken Ife, macroeconomic policy analyst, and Wale Olowade, CEO, Growth Masters Consulting. Thank you both for coming on this morning.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We are back in a moment. Stay with us.